sip of coffee.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of Open Source in Business, which is a speaker series of conversations with industry experts with a very wide lens on the role of open source and the role that it plays in the industry at large. I'm Dave Neary, and today I'm joined by Dirk Riehle, who is a researcher with the University of Erlangen in Berlin. He's a professor of open source, and he has a particular focus on the business of open source, having a decade in industry in addition to academia. And I'm also joined by Alyssa Wright, who's the head of community and partner development at the OpenCollective, which is a nonprofit focused on providing fiscal sponsorship to open source projects and currently manages over 200 projects.
2,000.
2,000, apologies. Order of magnitude or undersold you there. So today's topic is the labor economics, the open source labor. And it's been one of my favorite catchphrases. Is the most popular business model in open source is get a job, because it's the way that most people who work on open source make a living. Dirk, you've been researching this topic for a number of years, and I'd love to know what do you see as the labor market of open source software developers like right now?
Hi, Dave. So thanks a lot for having me on your fabulous podcast. So to your question, the labor market is definitely getting better, meaning employers increasingly understand the value of open source. And we are talking not about the usual suspect, the usual companies you're talking about, but lots of other companies which are not in the first row, but rather are often selling products that aren't even software. Yeah. So from the automotive, from other industries, they all understand the value of open source in their products, whatever they are. And so they're hiring definitely for open source capabilities and competence, or they use open source as a measuring stick of how good a developer is. So definitely being an open source developer is helpful for finding a job in software engineering and software development.
Is there you've mentioned a lot of industry sectors there and some non-IT companies. So it seems to me that there's a very wide range of areas where people are hiring open source developers. How do you pick the promising projects to work on that will showcase your skills in a way that will maximize your opportunity of getting a job?
All right. So you're already making the assumption that in order to get a job, like having open source on your resume is beneficial. And I agree, but you actually have to view this in kind of stages. There are different things that give you more value, if you will. And that's perhaps how you should look at it if you are that totally rational, focused person on your career. So saying that, first of all, you will be best off if you actually find projects that you enjoy and love. So that will definitely make your life better. And I'm saying that because this entirely rational perspective is helpful, but obviously only part of it. So what does open source give you? So we know that hiring managers, engineering managers at least, definitely look at your resume and ask where is the GitHub, GitLab link to some open source project you worked on. So the basic demonstration of your engineering skills in an open source project is already valuable, simply because you can't show code from your old employer, right? That's proprietary. So if you have worked in open source, you're just demonstrating basic skills. But it goes beyond that, because as you work in an open source project, you're also demonstrating social skills. I think it's not even a dirty secret. Like everyone knows you want to have nice coworkers. So the ability to work in a team, as demonstrated, for example, from going to be just a contributor to a core team member of some open source project, is already that shows an employer and future colleagues you're a person one can work with, right? So there's an increasing certification of sorts of your ability as you engage in open source and more deeply engage. You're also asking how to identify the best project. That is actually getting hard because You can be very entrepreneurial, and then maybe you pick the right project that a couple of years from now will be super hot and you will be totally in demand. The problem is you can't predict the future. So you can follow trends, you can look at data or so, but I think guts and community you are in will better help you. Now, you can actually turn it around. You can actually look for employers, and IT is pretty good, meaning you can actually, to some extent, choose employers with the request to be working on open source projects that are of relevance to the employer. So maybe they let you, and that is your entry to a career in open source in parallel to what you're doing for the employer.
Okay.
And then you have your foot in the door. And
yeah, it's a nice idea.
Yeah.
But it's something you said caught my attention, and I'd be interested to get both of your perspectives on this, is that it occurs to me that the ability to get a lot of open source experience assumes a certain level of, for want of a better word, privilege. That there's a certain bar to participating voluntarily in open source projects. In the context of increasing diversity in the computer industry, and making sure that we're maximizing the talent that we bring into this industry by identifying people who don't have maybe that privilege, what kind of opportunities exist for people who maybe don't have the same access to technology, or who don't have the same, for want of a better expression, temporal liberty, the free time to spend working on open source projects? How can we address that problem? Alyssa, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I would love
one of those questions that's a little bit tricky.
Yeah, tricky is one word for it. I think it's a really difficult question, and something that I think many of us in open source and definitely within like the open source collective endeavor is trying to understand and address. So first of all, I also want to thank everybody here. It's really a pleasure to be able to like speak about, I think, such kind of relevant questions and issues, and they are truly part of my own like explorations. And for us, Open Source Collective is designed to allow people that are responsible for open source projects, that are building open source projects, that are part of open source communities and ecosystems, that they are able to make a living in that commitment. And that living, quote unquote, that might be within a business structure, like we were just talking about, and working for a company that allows them to participate in open source communities, or it can be independent and outside of a business like entity and framework. And I think it's important to even in the conversation about diversity, recognize that what contribution looks like, what self-sufficiency looks like, is varied across all of us. And then when it comes to being able, so I bring this up because we very much see the kind of like model of open source collective, of being able to support like one's open source, providing fiscal structure to support open source development, is an equity issue. Like, is about building resiliency in the open source community, and this is as much for the college graduate who is working on an open source project in their free time while they might be working at a company, to open source developers in marginalized communities in like sub-Saharan Africa. And it's and I think from my perspective, to answer that question specifically, I think that allowing people to be part of open source like innovation and development and health from many different types of contribution, and sometimes that contribution might be with the privilege of being able to do development because they have a good Wi-Fi connection, because they have extra time, because they maybe don't have family commitments. But I also think there's a lot of value in having people like share their experiences, of using an open source project, like maybe in their day-to-day or in explorations, like in even as user testers, and different types of capacity and expertise. So I guess to answer the question, diversifying what community looks like, I think, is a way to allow for diversity of participation. I hope that made some sense. I know we got to a lot of places. Yeah,
that was brilliant. By the way, the fall colors in North Carolina look beautiful behind you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
think it's worth pointing out some of the non-profit initiatives. I'm sorry, Dirk. I think it's worth pointing out some of the
I wanted to add that some barriers really have come down thanks to open source. So, basic technical access has made it possible to actually read into open source. So much more is documented. So much more of current infrastructure is open source. Compare that with the old days where it was proprietary technology, where maybe you had to pay expensive seminars just to be able to use a particular proprietary piece of software. So many, not all, clearly not all, but many barriers have come down through internet access and the openness around open source projects, just in terms of documentation, being able to use it, being able to provide services, and that way to get into the labor market. Definitely, there are many more barriers that need to come down from cultural aspects, social aspects, cultural aspects, other diversity aspects. But we see that those also sometimes have not been as bad as we assumed. So for a while, for example, we thought, China is not contributing to open source at all. You can measure some of that in our research we did, as people are contributing. You can count the commits basically to code repositories and see where they are coming from. But China now is developing a thriving own open source ecosystem. And clearly what we thought was wrong at the time, which is that collaboration values in different cultures might prevent contribution to open source. So working hypothesis of many academics was the collaboration values of open source are so Western, maybe Eastern more countries would not easily pick up for that. And it's clearly not the case. So maybe it's more like developers is the actual dimension how to look at people here.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. And I think it's worth also calling out that there are, a number of great nonprofit initiatives out there that are trying to bring digital literacy and developer skills earlier in the education cycle, things like Scratch, coder dojos, things like that are initiatives like the Hour of Code that are trying to create a sort of a movement to increase computer literacy in school. And I think that it's also worth calling out some of the initiatives like Black Girls Code or other initiatives that are specifically targeting underrepresented communities. So I think but I appreciate the point that open source is actually, rather than raising barriers, has removed some of the barriers that used to exist, and now we're just noticing other barriers, right? Which is good. It's progress, but we're still not where we want to be. Alyssa, so for a lot of developers, the goal is not just to get paid to work on a project, any project, I don't care. They want to work on the project that they care about, the project that they're developing or maintaining. And I think, your organization is one of the examples of the ways in which developers are now kind of brainstorming with models like Patreon to figure out how to get paid for the project that they work on in a sustainable way. Do you have some perspectives on like what kind of advice do you give to an open source developer when they're at that point where they decide, I want to try and make money from this work that I'm doing?
Again, actually a really good question as well, because I think we all recognize that it's sometimes hard to surface like the value, to put a financial, price tag on the value of open source contribution. We know that it's kind of underpins like so much of our, technical lives and the development of work. But how do we articulate like the value and the value that you're that you're worth? And so one of the major things that I think also research from Carnegie Mellon supports is that part of what we recommend is that people ask to be paid. We often do, if they are looking to find a sustainable avenues to support their project, their work. One of the most significant movements towards that is asking, perhaps with real specificity about what that contribution will go to, the impact that it will make. Sometimes you just don't know that people are looking for support, and so we encourage open source projects to ask, and that's what the platform is kind of designed to do as well, or at least support with providing avenues for kind of outlining a budget and goal aims towards that budget. I think another thing that projects can do is we've discussed how it's not. I think with open source, you're not selling the code, like the development. You're actually what's valuable for a project is your time, and that is something that is is also worth. Or I would encourage developers to kind of trying to figure out what's the price tag on that, talking to and providing to potential funders what the roadmap looks like, what might be, upcoming, breaks and updates, responding and providing training for teams, working with developers and responding to, bugs. This is the time that investment that I think helps to translate to being financially backed and sustained as well.
So do you recommend more a kind of a model of identifying a smaller number of people who will pay for hours, like consulting hours, providing an SLA for response time, that kind of thing, getting a retainer type model? Or do you advocate more the wide-based but shallow subscription model, $10 a month to support the project?
It's funny. I think both can be successful, and probably, the answer lies in the nature of the project. But I think, me personally, and what I try to support within Open Source Collective, and even my, previous roles in open source space, is the former. I think that there's a lot with that's available in a support contract, in added on consulting hours, in training, and encouraging that the pot, the community of people that are supporting and sustaining the project, is not just yourself, but also a collective of people. And so I think that sustaining the projects is like a kind of a mechanism for sustaining yourself as well.
Okay. I do think that there's a starting point, which is that if your project is not providing sufficient value to people, if you don't have a big enough user base, or people who are relying on your project for some kind of commercial activity, you're going to have a very hard time selling either of those models, either the subscription model or the bigger model. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I think that I think, Dirk, you had brought up the importance of the social aspect of open source and its value when being considered by company, being brought in by a company. I think that it's also really important to kind of look at and emphasize the relationships that you build I think it's just as important as like the development that you're building as well. So attending events that may be hosted by people that you think are could find value in your work, looking at their projects and being engaged with them. So that, at a minimum, you're building trust. Looking, anything that comes in as a bug, you're responding to. And I think that type of kind of review or prioritization, even in the most informal ways, I think would be valuable in kind of further developing like the importance of and value of the work to a potential backer. I think also what's interesting about that is you learn as a developer what people are interested in, what is most important, because you can't. It's almost like an informal like user research, and so I think that's like seeing that as not like something extra that you that takes you away from the development, but rather something that really adds to the quality of what you're building, is also like an important part, I think, to building and establishing value of your project.
It's an interesting point that harkens back to episode 1 of this series, which was open source product management, and where we had product managers talking about the open source project as being an ideal place to do field research on user needs and capture requirements. So thank you for bringing that up. It allows me to pimp another episode.
Can I jump in there with a comment? I think there are basically three different forms of how you can stay with your favorite open source project. The first one we talked about in the beginning, which is get hired by someone to work on that project because it's important to that employer. Once you achieve that, it's not easy to get there, but once you are working on an open source project of commercial relevance, that is a community project, meaning it's not owned by your employer in some way, you're actually in a good position because you get this additional free agency in addition to just being an employee, because other companies will also be very much interested in hiring you if it's Kubernetes or something that is just very relevant. So you can find an employer if you're involved with a high profile or even medium profile relevant open source project. The second one you touched on only shortly, or Alyssa touched on when talking about labor, meaning you can run if you want to be independent, so not get hired, but really remain independent. You can be a freelancer and consultant, but then as you implied, you mostly will be selling your time to do custom development, of which you hope then, not guaranteed, but hope it goes back into the project, right? But the interesting thing is, and I really think it's helpful to make this a third separate step, is turning your enthusiasm for an open source project into a product company for that open source project, which is different from just consulting. So meaning now you're trying to do a product and selling a product, whether that's Red Hat Enterprise Linux or so, it's just very different from being paid for your time. The product could start out with a retainer relationship where you're kind of giving insurance, selling insurance, all the way to packaging it and building on the open source project for some commercial product or service. But that, I find it hard. There is a possibility that you stay small and are comfortable, but if the project is really important, the open source project is really important, there will just be a strong pull to grow, or other people will do it. So that it's really hard to have a sweet spot of yourself, or you and a small crew enjoying life with your own small company. So this beyond freelancing, then there's the scaling up startup, and in between that's hard. That sweet spot is not hard. It's hard to be in long term and be happy.
I would really like to spend the rest of our time talking about starting up a business around a kind of a small boutique business around a company. But before that, I do want to we have a couple of questions.
Can I just clarify one point?
Yes.
when it comes to like looking at the value of time, I didn't mean to imply that that's about consulting. That I think like time can be support, time can be the retainer, time can be like sharing the roadmap, or you know, first insight into the roadmap. Like time is what, as opposed to the code base, time is really what you know, we see as like kind of an avenue for sustainability. But yes, let's hit the questions. Yeah, exactly. It's the rare resource.
So we have a couple of questions that I think are interesting. One from Deborah Bryant. What is the most recent academic work that has been published in the area of diversity, especially in demographics of contributor communities? And Dirk, do you have any insights into?
Well, the keyword academic probably points to me. I'm thinking about it. Unfortunately, I honestly don't know what's going on specifically in diversity research and open source, implying it's probably necessary to have much more.
Okay.
Sorry, Deborah.
And a question from Josh. So a decade ago, there were some interesting attempts, and I'm not sure, the question was not on diversity, but in general, the demographics of open source contributor communities.
The general trend in the data that we see is indeed what I said earlier, a pickup of open source all around the world. For me, the big one was that China is finally catching up. I've traveled over the years many times, and only 10 years ago, the government tried to, kicking and screaming, get paid companies to do open source. And what didn't work 10 years ago is working really well today. So beyond Western cultures, I do see that there's clearly diversity along that dimension around the world. Among more other social dimensions, again, I'm not so sure.
Okay.
From my research and learning, like something that's always been really interesting to me is that often open source, and this is historically, open source actually doesn't do as well as proprietary software in terms of diversity, or at least in when it comes to gender representation. And I think there was a study again of Wikipedia back in like 2010 or something, where 2.5% of contributors were female. And there's been, I think, an industry-wide reflection on why that is and what that means. And I come specifically from the OpenStreetMap community, where we also had many struggles with diversity, even though it's a global map. I mean, there should be people from all over the world contributing, and yet it was a very had kind of select demographic of who was participating. And we have seen, and I think kind of seen in other communities, that there has been change. I think that there's an acknowledgement that there's many different types of expertise that is needed in an open source community, including maybe perhaps a person who's going to write the business plan for a startup. That there is many different perspectives that need to be brought in to have a successful project, and that fundamentally, like I think we've seen in technology work, fundamentally is that having diversity in the room as you're creating something makes for a better project and solution. And so I am very hopeful about the diversity of open source. And when we look at the open source projects that we're supporting at Open Source Collective, they do reflect a diversity of people. And it's important for us also that the governance of how we work and the governance of the projects that we support take that into consideration. And for example, our board, we really try to make sure that we have representation from underserved and marginalized communities. So I think that there's a lot that we're doing around diversity, and a lot we need to continue to do. But again, it's a space that I'm hopeful for and in. So,
great.
Yes. So go
so
team.
You mentioned writing business plans there. So that was actually kind of leading into the next topic, getting back to if you're working on an open source project and you want to figure out how to make a business out of it, like a small business, a startup, and not a venture funded startup, but this is something that will keep you and maybe a few other people employed. What kind of things do you have to think about going into a business plan for something like that? Dirk, do you want to have a first go at this?
Sure. It's a Silicon Valley style definition, but it's still a general one for a startup is some organization in search of a working business model. So you don't know what you will be earning your money from yet. So you need to figure that out. And that's how you should structure your activities, learning what creates value for your potential customers. It's obviously not the source code itself, if it's open source. I think I think this is an important distinction to make. We are obviously talking about community open source where the copyright is shared broadly. That's the type of project we're talking about, because everything else, if some company owns the copyright, we're off to a venture funded, scale up, wants to be a unicorn type of startup. So you're asking about its community. Then we are back to retainer models. That's the obvious one for a freelancer to start with. If it's a widely used software that has its users, whatever, Blender or so, and you have companies that are your customers for that, find out what they care about. Is it additional features? Is it the insurance to be able to call someone late at night because something's not working? What are the features for that? The interesting thing is all the features that companies care about as your customers, they are well known. Just look to a regular classic proprietary vendor. What they know is what customers want. So look whether you can recreate that in open source and explore that. Does that work for your potential customer base?
Alyssa, what would your advice be on kind of business plan 101 for an open source software developer who's like just getting started?
Yeah. Again, I mean, I don't want to underestimate like this. It's a hard thing to do. And it's not insurmountable. I mean, and we're all doing, I suppose, like hard things, but give yourself some kindness when putting together one's first business plan. We've said it a couple times, and I think that this is such an important concept of thinking about value. Like, what is the value of your work? What is the value of your team? What is the value of your perspective for the ecosystem and for the companies, entities that might be your financial base. So anything that you can do either on your own or in partnership of trying to both identify and put a financial value on that value, I think is really important. Like Dirk was saying, I mean, a lot of that might already be public and easily accessible, like once going to the right places. I think what companies can do in partnership is help. I'm really always interested in companies also being aware of the value of the open source in their work, in their supply chains. That I think that will be really important information in trying to kind of construct a business plan. And then the value of the entire larger ecosystem that you fit into. Like what is this? You're one project in maybe maybe it's applicable in like, self-driving cars. Like, what does that quote market look like, in 5-10 years? I think seeing the seeing and articulating and putting like real, like quantified, informed, research numbers and examples for the value of your work, I think is kind of like a starting point for building any sort of business model. And it's not just a business model. I think it's also your product roadmap. This is really like useful information for your own sort of creation and development process. So
I think one of the key points for me is to realize that your product may be something completely independent of the project. When we were discussing this in prep, one of the things I said is that what you may be able to sell might not be what you'd like to do, right? If you're developing a JavaScript framework, what you may be able to sell is developing web pages using that JavaScript framework rather than, getting people to pay you to maintain the JavaScript framework. And there are a few examples that come to mind in that vein. The Drupal, for example, has this awesome commercial community of people who are all collaboratively maintaining Drupal, but the main business model around Drupal is developing and deploying Drupal-based websites. Basecamp is another example of a project where you've got this awesome open source community around Ruby on Rails, but the product that the company created is Basecamp as a software as a service. And so I think it's important to kind of think about the fact that maybe what you will be able to sell is not what you would like to be doing with all of your time.
But I think connecting it to the quality of what you sell is connected to the quality of this underlying framework and pricing your work to make sure that you can like continue to maintain like this like shared open source project.
Yep.
So I'm looking at my laundry list of what software vendors kind of sell. And so I think you touched on most of the things. Still, it's worth mentioning that additional functionality, even though it smells like open core, is sometimes just acceptable. You have something in addition to the open source software that you're just selling as software. Documentation and training materials are also equally relevant, and intellectual property you can sell. Access to self-help services, forums, mailing lists, etc. More classic guarantees, fitness for use or certification. That already sounds like a larger company, but if you can take the software and certify it for some particular environment, say some particular hardware, that would be valuable to potential customers. Then the usual support hotline or on-site servicing you can do. You mentioned consulting, in-house training. Well, actually operations, yeah, that's the big one. You operate the software for someone in your cloud. That makes life much easier for customers. With that, looking at it from a business model perspective, so we talked about the value proposition of the classic Silicon Valley business model canvas. In addition, there are other aspects to a good business model, which is, for example, what resources do you have? And that brings us back to the original labor market question, which is, are you a committer? Are you a core developer? Or are you just a small-time contributor? So your position in an open source project determines the price you can ask for example, for your services. And so that is actually really hard economics. We may not always like it, but I really like Alyssa saying, like, think hard about the financial value and don't give it away for free.
Thank you. And there was a
Can
talk,
I also?
Yeah, far ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many respects we all empathize with like this challenge because it's hard, I think, for us to find the business model for the open source projects that we care about. And one of the reasons why I've been a part of open source work, since the very beginning, is that there are resources all around you, and people that like either like Dirk researches this space, or we contribute to our own communities, and so I feel like nobody who's doing this needs to do it alone, and that I hope that, yeah, that is, I think one of the strengths of this space is that, like, you know, build a business model, try your best, but there are so many other people that can help you along the way.
Yeah, I think the network is super important, and it's kind of the key point that open source gives you is that public access to a network of professional network. I wonder, have either of you seen successful examples of, because one of those places where open source dominates is system libraries, developer frameworks. Have you seen any successful examples of smaller companies bootstrapping through partnerships, working with bigger companies that are providing solutions based on that framework? I'm wondering if working with system integrators is a successful potential avenue.
Well, we've seen a lot of collectives like quite successful in building a budget to support like a small team, and what's, you know, unique is that they haven't like necessarily like they incorporated as like a business, but rather as like a collective, and we provide like the fiscal, you know, infrastructure. Babel, ESLint, Webpack, I think, are all examples of where they've been able to build a budget, build partnerships with larger contributors. I think also what's, you know, equally important, build partnerships with smaller contributors. And so with like kind of collective support, continue to grow their work. And that is kind of, again, our goal, or one of our goals with Open Source Collective, is that we are able to see more and more projects do that.
Thank you. So to wrap up our conversation, I'm going to go back to Q&A. It was a little bit orthogonal to the discussion, so I left it until the end. Josh asks, a decade ago, there were some interesting attempts to expand open source organizing principles to other industries, such as the movie post-production sector. These initiatives seem to have largely gone away. Do you think that open source principles will remain limited to the tech workforce? And I'm not sure exactly what Josh means by open source principles, but I guess, you know, collaborative principles, working across silos, working transparently, those kind of things. Josh, if you have any precisions you'd like to offer, pipe up in chat, and I will invite you on screen.
So, shall we answer to that? Are you waiting for Josh? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think he added a little bit of clarification, where it also includes collective ownership of work between companies. Yeah, I have my opinion of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so they're classic cooperative. They wouldn't use open source principles, but across all industries, they're cooperatives. I think what is important is that they are just lagging. So you can argue open source style collaboration gave us open data, gave us wikis, gave us Wikipedia, is giving us open hardware, is giving us open access. So it's making its way as a way of collaboration independent of just software into all other industries. Now, all other types of activities. Now, talking about industries, the movie post-production, I'm not sure whether that was a specific reference to the movie industry joining forces to develop open source software, because that is a really interesting topic, that we now have companies which are not software vendors sponsoring the development of open source software for the need to basically get rid of vendor lock-in from commercial products that they've depended on so far. So that is an important topic, because the IT industry is large, but the rest of the industry is even larger than the IT industry. And once they get their understanding of how to do collaborative software development, sponsor it, we'll be looking at a whole new world in software.
You're on mute, Alyssa. I'm trying to unmute you. No, can't. It's on your side.
So I see something about blenders. Oops, she's gone. Oh, well, just something on Blender. I definitely have a student who is a very happy Blender supporter and follows the retainer model and is surviving. Yeah, so it's not entirely dead.
I'm a big fan of that project. I will say, in addition, that we're increasingly seeing, but it does seem to be limited to software initiatives. We're increasingly seeing initiatives in new industry verticals that are coming to open source and collaboration for, shared heavy lifting on what these industries would like to be commodity shared infrastructure projects. Some examples are the network functions virtualization movement in telecommunications, running 5G on open source software, healthcare, finance, even resource extraction. The oil and gas industry are sharing on these are collaborating on these common software platforms to provide access to data. So data interoperability, file format interoperability, and access through common interfaces that are implemented in open source are all very much industry trends across a number of verticals, which I think is an interesting development. It seems like Alyssa has lost the network. I would like to wait for her to rejoin to thank you both for this conversation. I would like to give you the final word, Dirk, on what you, in addition to everything that we've discussed, do you have any additional insight on the labor economics around open source?
So going back to that original question, I can only tell you what I tell my students basically is that they should get their hands wet in open source because it has the full range of opportunities that it affords them, from the basic GitHub link on their profile that lets some employer check what they did, which reduces the hiring risk to an employer to get started in industry, all the way to gaining additional personal freedom and free agency by being involved in relevant open source projects that simply make it easier to switch employers if you're not happy. So it's absolutely a fabulous world out there for our students or anyone in IT. The topic that we had at the end is also really important because we counted at some point of time the number of foundations that sprung up from industries that are not the software industries. So we're talking education, automotive, always automotive, but also completely non-IT like libraries forming foundations to develop the software they need. So that is a big trend. What that means for vendors and the enormous amounts of money being made in the IT industry remains to be seen, but maybe the rest of the world is asking for some of its money back or independence back, which might be a good thing given the significance of.
And we do plan. We do plan to have an episode on industry collaboration efforts in foundations and joint platforms in the future. So I'll look forward to seeing you all back for that. Alyssa, welcome back. And
Thank you.
I saw the contribution that you made on chat. Would you like to, particularly, I know from an OpenStreetMap point of view, OpenStreetMap has kind of built itself for the last decade on being a shared resource for so many different projects and initiatives. Would you like to share what you've seen in that area, and then I will wrap us up.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good. Thank you. I'm not sure what I missed, but I will say that I do think, and I have seen that there is so many elements of open source like development that are carried into other spaces and environments, whether it's even technical or not, and that does include, like, transparency and creation, the collaboration, like collaborative, nature, even the agility. But in terms of, I really like the question about, joint ownership. I think that you see more and more so these like public-private relationships where there's these, these consortiums of different government entities and private expertise, like coming together to build like various degrees of like open data, open technologies, open resources. They may not all be open, and they may be like kind of little in gray areas of purpose. But I do think that they speak to a time of, and they speak to not only a time, but also I think a recognition that there is not in citizens' best interest. It's not in like company best interest to own things in a siloed space, and that rather there is this kind of need to collaboratively share, and back to Open Source Collective, collaboratively support like software technology development. So I think, and maybe I'm overly hopeful, but I think I'm really impressed with and excited for how much we have learned from open source development, even beyond like the software projects that we have. But it's really, I think, has shifted the way we work and work with one another. So yeah, maybe end with that.
So I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. I'd like to thank the Red Hat developer team for hosting us for the first 3 episodes of this. From next week, we'll be on a different Crowdcast channel, so watch out for that. Our next episode is the evolution of the open source nonprofit, which is, we will be joined by Karen Sandler from the Software Freedom Conservancy and Rich Bowen, former board member of the Apache Foundation, to discuss how, and Stephen Wally will be curating that discussion, to discuss how the open source nonprofits have evolved from, say, 20 years ago, where you had single project nonprofits like the GNOME Foundation, Python Software Foundation, to the modern open source nonprofit, and how their role has evolved in terms of enabling collaboration across industries. So I look forward to seeing you all for that. And this video will be going to YouTube. It's actually been live streaming to YouTube if I did this right. Thank you both. Thank you both for joining me. I think this was a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all at future editions.
Thanks, Dave, so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.